The laughter started before Silas Crenshaw had even finished reading the will. It was November 3rd, 1871, and the air in the lawyer's cramped office in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, smelled of tobacco smoke and cheap ink. Outside, the first hard frost of the season had painted the windows with delicate crystalline patterns, but inside, the atmosphere was anything but delicate. Silas's two older brothers, Marcus and Theodore, had been snickering since the moment Mr. Pemberton unfolded their father's final testament and began to read. The division was simple enough. Marcus, the eldest at 42, received the family's 300 acres of prime bottomland along the White River, plus the farmhouse their grandfather had built. Theodore, 38, and already red-faced from years of whiskey and easy living, got the general store in town, the warehouse behind it, and $4,000 in cash. Their father had built these things over 40 years of backbreaking labor, and now they passed to his favored sons like water flowing downhill. Silas, the youngest at 31, received 80 acres of rocky hillside that their father had won in a card game 15 years prior. Land so steep and worthless that Elijah Crenshaw had never even bothered to walk its boundaries. Land that locals called the Devil's Washboard for its limestone ridges and sinkholes. "Well now," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair with a smile that showed too many teeth. "I suppose little brother finally got what he deserved." Theodore's wife, Cornelia, who had insisted on attending despite having no legal standing, let out a laugh like a saw blade hitting a nail. "Perhaps he can find some rocks to eat up there. Lord knows there's nothing else." Silas said nothing. He had learned long ago that words were just sounds. They couldn't hurt him unless he let them. He folded the deed carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket, while his brothers divided up their father's pocket watch and gold cufflinks. "You'll be back within a month," Marcus predicted, already counting the bills from his portion. "Crawling down from that hillside, begging for work. I might even give it to you. Mucking stalls, maybe. Something suited to your station." Silas picked up his hat from the rack by the door. It was the same worn felt hat he'd worn through 4 years of war and 6 years of wandering afterward, working farms and reading books in whatever town would have him. He settled it on his head and looked at his brothers one final time. "I expect I'll manage," he said. Then he walked out into the cold, and he did not look back. The journey to his inheritance took 3 days on foot. Silas had sold his horse 2 months earlier to pay for his father's medicine, a fact his brothers had conveniently forgotten. And now he carried everything he owned in a canvas pack on his shoulders. 2 changes of clothes, a knife his father had given him before the war, a small collection of books wrapped in oilcloth, Darwin's On the Origin of Species, a treatise on geology, and a worn copy of Thoreau's Walden, a tinderbox, $47 in savings, and a heart that refused to break, no matter how many times his family tried to shatter it. The land revealed itself slowly as he climbed away from the river valley. The limestone bluffs rose like frozen waves, their faces pocked with dark openings that might have been caves or might have been shadows. The forest here was different from the lowlands, cedar and stunted oak clinging to thin soil, their roots gripping stone like desperate fingers. In the valleys between the ridges, small springs trickled through carpets of moss, and once Silas saw a black bear watching him from a thicket of autumn gold hickory. On the evening of November 6th, he reached the boundary of his property. A rusted survey marker jutted from a crack in the limestone, nearly hidden by dead leaves. Beyond it, the land rose steeply toward a ridge that locals had told him was impassable. Silas smiled for the first time in weeks. Impassable to most, perhaps. But he had learned during the war that impossible was usually just another word for difficult. He made camp that night in a shallow overhang at the base of a cliff, building a small fire and eating the last of the hardtack he'd brought from town. The stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its mate. Silas fell asleep with his back against the cold stone, dreaming of nothing at all. He found the cave on his third day of exploring the property. It wasn't much to look at from outside, just a dark mouth in the hillside, perhaps 4 feet high and 6 feet wide, half hidden by a tangle of wild grapevines. But something about it called to him. Perhaps it was the way the air moved near the entrance, a faint exhalation that carried warmth even on that cold November morning. Perhaps it was the smell, not the musty decay he expected, but something almost mineral, almost alive. Silas lit the candle he carried and stepped inside. The passage sloped downward for perhaps 30 feet before opening into a chamber that made him catch his breath. The ceiling rose to twice his height, its surface rippled with formations that looked like frozen waterfalls in the flickering light. The floor was sandy and relatively flat, scattered with fallen stones but largely clear. And everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, tucked into alcoves and clinging to ledges, crystals glittered like captured stars. But it was the temperature that truly amazed him. Outside, the morning had been cold enough to see his breath. In here, the air felt like a mild spring day. Silas pulled off his coat, then his sweater, and still he wasn't cold. He held his hand near the cave wall and felt warmth radiating from the stone itself. He explored deeper, following the passage as it wound through the earth. The warmth increased as he descended. After perhaps 200 feet, the passage opened into a second chamber, and here Silas stopped completely, unable to believe what his candle revealed. A pool of water filled half the chamber, its surface perfectly still and clear as glass. Steam rose from it in lazy spirals. The bottom was visible even in the dim light, smooth stone worn by ages of water, perhaps 15 feet down at its deepest point. And along one edge, a crack in the rock released a steady flow of water that was almost too hot to touch. A hot spring, deep beneath the worthless hillside that his brothers had mocked him for inheriting. Silas sat down on a boulder beside the pool and began to laugh. Not the bitter laugh of irony, but the genuine, wondering laugh of a man who has just discovered that the universe has a sense of humor after all. The first winter tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had shelter. The cave itself was warmer than any house he'd ever known. But warmth alone doesn't keep a man alive. He needed food, water that wasn't scalding, tools, supplies. The nearest town was a full day's walk, and the residents there had already heard Marcus's version of events. They looked at Silas with pity at best, contempt at worst. The cave hermit, the fool who thought he could survive on rocks. But Silas had learned patience during the war, crouching in trenches for days while bullets sang overhead. He had learned observation during his wandering years, watching how successful men built things that lasted, and he had learned from his books that nature, properly understood, was not an enemy to be conquered, but a partner to be cultivated. He began with the basics. The hot spring provided not just warmth, but a constant source of clean water. He discovered that a channel carved in the stone floor allowed the overflow to cool as it traveled toward the cave entrance, arriving at a comfortable temperature for drinking and cooking. The warmth of the cave itself, he realized after weeks of careful measurement with a thermometer purchased in town, remained remarkably constant. 68 degrees Fahrenheit in the main chamber, rising to over 100 near the spring itself. This was the Earth's own heat, rising from deep below, captured and held by the massive limestone formations. He hunted when he could, preserving meat in a natural cold storage alcove he discovered near the cave entrance, where air currents kept the temperature near freezing even while the inner chambers remained warm. He gathered nuts and dried fruits in the autumn, supplementing his supplies with careful purchases from town. He built a wooden frame over the cave entrance, then covered it with a canvas flap that he could raise or lower to regulate airflow. By Christmas of 1871, he had created a living space that was warmer, drier, and more comfortable than most houses in the county. But comfort wasn't enough. Silas wanted to understand. He spent hours each day mapping the cave system, measuring temperatures at different points, observing how the air moved and the water flowed. He wrote his findings in a leather journal, filling page after page with careful diagrams and notes. The geology treatise he'd brought became his Bible. He compared its descriptions to what he saw around him, teaching himself the language of stone. The crystals, he learned, were primarily calcite, calcium carbonate deposited over thousands of years by mineral-rich water seeping through the limestone. Some were clear as ice, others milky white or tinted with iron deposits that gave them colors ranging from pale yellow to deep rust. In one small alcove, he discovered a cluster of formations that glowed with an eerie blue-green light when he extinguished his candle. Phosphorescent minerals that had absorbed the candlelight and now released it slowly. The hot spring itself fascinated him most. He calculated its flow rate by timing how long it took to fill a bucket. He measured its temperature at different points, from the near boiling emergence to the comfortable bathing temperature of the main pool. He even, cautiously, respectfully, explored the underwater channel from which the water emerged, discovering that it descended at a steep angle into darkness too deep for his candle to penetrate. By February, the townspeople's pity had shifted to confusion. The cave hermit should have been dead by now, frozen or starved or simply defeated by the harsh Ozark winter. Instead, Silas appeared in town every few weeks, healthy and calm, purchasing supplies with money earned from pelts and gathering news from the outside world. He spoke little and smiled less, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence that made people uncomfortable. "He's gone mad up there," Cornelia told anyone who would listen. "Living in a hole in the ground like an animal. It's shameful, really. Poor Elijah would be horrified." But Silas wasn't listening. He was building. The breakthrough came in the spring of 1872. Silas had been experimenting with ways to channel the hot spring's heat throughout the cave system. He'd noticed that the main chamber, despite being 20 feet from the spring, stayed warmer than the entrance area. This wasn't just the Earth's constant temperature. There was actual heat transfer happening, carried by the steam and warm air that rose from the pool. He built a series of stone channels and wooden ducting that directed the warm airflow, creating a primitive but effective heating system that raised the temperature in the outer chambers by nearly 10 degrees. Then he went further, digging a shallow trench that carried hot water along the perimeter of his main living area before allowing it to drain back toward the pool. The water cooled as it traveled, releasing its heat into the stone floor, which in turn radiated warmth upward. It was, he realized with growing excitement, the same principle the ancient Romans had used in their Hippocaust heating systems. But where they had burned wood to create heat, he was using the earth itself, an endless, free supply of warmth that required no fuel and produced no smoke. He was still refining this system when the geologist arrived. Professor Heinrich Weber was a German immigrant teaching at the University of Arkansas, and he had heard rumors of unusual cave formations in the Ozark Hills. He arrived in early May, a stout man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a beard that would have been impressive on a much larger person. He fully expected to find an illiterate hermit living in squalor. What he found instead stopped him cold. Silas's cave dwelling had been transformed. The entrance was now a proper doorway, framed in cedar and fitted with a heavy wooden door. Inside, the main chamber had been divided into functional areas using waist-high walls of carefully stacked stone. There was a living space with a bed frame and wool blankets, a kitchen area with a clever arrangement of hot and cold running water, a workshop filled with tools and half-finished projects, and a reading nook where Silas had built shelves directly into the cave wall to hold his growing collection of books. The air was warm and surprisingly fresh, circulated by the natural draft that Silas had learned to manage with adjustable vents. The floor was level and clean, covered in places with woven reed mats, and everywhere the crystals glittered in the light of carefully positioned oil lamps. Professor Weber stood in the center of this underground home and looked at Silas with entirely new eyes. "My God," he said, "you've built a geothermal system. Here, in the Arkansas wilderness, using nothing but observation and stone." Silas shrugged. "I read about the Romans. Figured if they could do it 2,000 years ago, I could probably manage." The professor stayed for 3 days. He measured and documented and questioned, and Silas answered as best he could, showing him the hot spring and explaining his observations about temperature gradients and airflow. By the time Weber left, he had invited Silas to give a lecture at the university, an invitation that Silas politely declined, and had promised to return with colleagues who would want to study this remarkable site. More importantly, he left Silas with a piece of advice. "The crystals in your back chamber," Weber said as he prepared to leave. "The clear ones with the double terminations. Those are quartz, not calcite. Very high quality. There are collectors in New York and Philadelphia who would pay handsomely for specimens like that." Silas had never thought of the crystals as anything other than beautiful. But after Weber left, he returned to the back chamber with new eyes and began to carefully collect the finest specimens. The first significant sale came in July of 1872. A dealer from St. Louis, following up on Professor Weber's correspondence, traveled to Silas's cave and purchased 37 crystal specimens for $140, more money than Silas had earned in the previous 2 years combined. But it was what the dealer said as he was leaving that changed everything. "You know," he remarked, wrapping the last specimen in cotton batting, "you're sitting on a potential resort here. Hot springs are all the rage back east. People travel hundreds of miles and pay good money to soak in mineral water. Claims it cures everything from rheumatism to melancholy." Silas thought about this for a long time after the dealer left. He wasn't interested in building a resort. The idea of crowds of strangers trampling through his cave, demanding towels and complaining about the accommodations, held no appeal whatsoever. But there was a middle way, perhaps, a path that could bring income without sacrificing the peace he had found. He began by expanding. Through the summer and fall of 1872, he carved out additional chambers, widening natural passages and creating rooms that could accommodate guests. He built 3 small bathing pools at different temperatures, fed by channels that could be adjusted to mix hot spring water with cooler cave water. He constructed a proper guest quarters near the entrance, with beds and furniture that he built himself from cedar harvested on his own land. And he was selective about who he admitted. No pleasure seekers or curiosity hounds. Only those who were genuinely suffering, the chronically ill, the injured, the exhausted. He charged what people could afford, and sometimes nothing at all, and he shared what he had learned about the healing properties of mineral water and the restorative power of constant warmth. The first patient to stay the full winter was a woman named Clara Thornton. She arrived in October of 1872, half carried by her brother, who had heard rumors of the cave healer from a traveling salesman. Clara was 34 years old and had been suffering from consumption for nearly 3 years. The doctors in Little Rock had told her family to prepare for the worst. The dry winter air of the Ozarks might help, they said, but probably not enough. Clara's brother expected to leave her in some filthy hole and return in the spring to collect her body. Instead, he found a clean, warm, underground sanctuary with fresh air, hot mineral baths, and a quiet, bearded man who showed his sister to a comfortable room and promised to do what he could. Silas had no medical training and made no promises, but he observed, as he always did, and he thought carefully about what he knew. The cave air was warm and humid, easier on damaged lungs than the cold, dry air outside. The mineral water was rich in sulfur and other compounds that might, or might not, have medicinal properties, and the isolation, the peace, the simple routine of rest and warmth and nourishment could do wonders for a body exhausted by illness. Clara stayed through the winter, and by March, she was strong enough to walk unaided for the first time in 2 years. She never fully recovered. Consumption had done too much damage, but she gained 5 years of comfortable life that the doctors had never expected. And she spent most of those years helping Silas build his strange underground paradise, organizing the guest quarters, managing correspondence, and teaching him things about running a household that his bachelor existence had never required. Silas fell in love with her slowly, the way water wears stone. It wasn't dramatic or passionate. Clara was too practical for drama, and Silas had never been comfortable with strong emotion. But by the summer of 1873, they had become partners in everything, and a wedding seemed merely a formality. They married in September, in a ceremony held at the cave entrance as the first autumn leaves began to fall. Professor Weber came down from Fayetteville. A few patients who had become friends attended. Clara's brother, initially skeptical of the caveman who had stolen his sister's heart, stood as witness. Neither of Silas's brothers came. They hadn't been invited. The next 15 years were the fullest of Silas's life. The reputation of the hot spring cave spread gradually, carried by satisfied patients and curious scientists. Silas never advertised and never sought attention, but attention found him anyway. A journalist from Harper's Weekly visited in 1876 and wrote a florid account that brought a flood of letters. A mining engineer from Colorado spent 3 weeks studying Silas's geothermal system and left convinced it could be applied to homes across the Mountain West. A wealthy industrialist from Chicago offered to buy the entire property for $10,000. Silas declined without hesitation. The crystal business grew as well. Silas had discovered additional deposits in chambers beyond the hot spring, and he harvested them carefully and sustainably, never taking more than the cave could regenerate. His specimens appeared in museums and private collections across the country. One particularly fine cluster, nearly 18 inches tall with perfect double-terminated points, sold to a Vanderbilt collector for $600. Through it all, Clara was his anchor. She managed the growing correspondence, kept the accounts, and gently reminded him to eat when he became absorbed in some new project. She converted one of the outer chambers into a library, gradually filling its shelves with scientific journals and medical texts that patients and visitors donated. She planted a garden in a sunny clearing above the cave, growing vegetables and herbs that supplemented their diet and provided remedies for minor ailments. In 1875, she gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas after Clara's father. 2 years later came a daughter, Eleanor. And in 1880, their last child arrived, another son, whom they named Elijah after Silas's father. In spite of everything, Silas taught his children as he had taught himself, through observation and questions, through books and practical work. Thomas showed an early aptitude for engineering and spent hours helping his father design improvements to the geothermal system. Eleanor preferred the crystals, learning to identify specimens and catalog them with scientific precision. Young Elijah, the most social of the three, was fascinated by the patients, spending hours listening to their stories and learning what brought them comfort. The cave itself continued to evolve. Silas expanded the bathing facilities, added guest rooms, and built a proper kitchen with running hot and cold water. He experimented with electrical lighting. A generator powered by a small waterfall near the cave entrance provided limited power by the late 1880s, though he kept the old oil lamps as backup and atmosphere. He published articles in scientific journals about cave temperature regulation and geothermal heating, and his correspondence included letters from engineers and architects across the country. And through all of this, he never spoke a word against his brothers. Marcus and Theodore had not prospered. The bottomland farm, mismanaged and stripped of timber, had been sold for taxes in 1878. The general store, bled dry by Theodore's gambling and Cornelia's extravagance, went bankrupt 2 years later. By 1880, both brothers were living in a boarding house in Little Rock, scraping by on odd jobs and nursing grudges against a world that had treated them so unfairly. Marcus died in 1883 of pneumonia complicated by alcohol and bitterness. Theodore lasted until 1887, carried off by the same consumption that had threatened Clara. Neither ever reconciled with Silas. Neither ever admitted that they had been wrong. Silas attended neither funeral, but he paid for both headstones quietly through a lawyer in town. Clara died in the spring of 1889, on a morning when the dogwoods were blooming white across the hillside. The consumption had never truly left her. It had only been held at bay by the warm air and mineral water and careful living. For 17 years, she had beaten the odds, raising 3 children and building a life of purpose and meaning in the most unlikely of places. But in the end, the disease claimed what it had always been owed. Silas was with her when she passed, holding her hand in the chamber they had shared for so many years. Her last words were characteristically practical. She told him where she had hidden the household accounts and reminded him that Thomas needed new boots for the winter. He buried her in the garden she had planted, beneath a limestone marker carved with crystals and flowers. For 3 months afterward, he spoke to no one except his children, spending his days in the deepest chambers of the cave, sitting beside the hot spring that had given him everything. But eventually, he emerged. There was work to be done, after all. There were patients who needed care and children who needed guidance and a legacy that needed protecting. Clara would have had sharp words for him if he'd abandoned all that for the sake of grief. He lived another 23 years after her death, growing old slowly in the place he had built from nothing. His hair went white, his hands grew gnarled from decades of working stone, and his eyesight dimmed until he could no longer read the books he loved. But his mind stayed sharp, and his children and grandchildren gathered around him to hear his stories and absorb his wisdom. Thomas became an engineer, designing geothermal heating systems for buildings across the Midwest. Eleanor married a geologist from the Smithsonian and traveled the world studying caves. She always said her father's crystal collection had set her on that path. Young Elijah, not so young by then, took over the hot spring operation, expanding it into a small but respected sanatorium that operated until the First World War. Silas's last years were spent much as his first ones had been, observing, questioning, learning. He kept a journal until the very end, recording temperature variations and crystal growth and the behavior of the spring. He developed a theory about the source of the hot water, volcanic activity deep beneath the Ozarks, he believed, remnants of ancient geological processes. That wasn't confirmed until geologists verified it in the 1950s. He died on February 14, 1912, at the age of 72, in the chamber beside the hot spring. His grandchildren had gathered the night before, somehow knowing that the end was near, and they kept vigil as the old man's breathing grew shallow and finally stopped. His last words, spoken to his eldest grandson, were these: "There's always more to find. Keep looking." They buried him beside Clara in the garden above the cave. The limestone marker matched hers, carved with crystals and the dates of his birth and death. Below the dates, at his request, they added a simple inscription: "He found what he needed." The hot spring cave remained in the family for another 3 generations. Silas's great-granddaughter finally donated it to the state of Arkansas in 1978, when the costs of maintenance exceeded what the family could bear. It operates today as a state park, visited by thousands each year who come to see the crystals and soak in the mineral pools and hear the story of the man who turned rejection into redemption. The main chamber looks much as it did in Silas's day. The stone walls still radiate warmth from the earth below. The crystals still glitter in the lamplight, electric now, but designed to mimic the oil lamps that Silas preferred. And the hot spring still flows, as it has for thousands of years and will for thousands more, indifferent to the small human dramas that play out above it. Scientists now understand the principles that Silas discovered through observation and intuition. The constant cave temperature is the result of the Earth's massive thermal inertia, the same phenomenon that keeps basements cool in summer and warm in winter. The hot spring draws from a geothermal reservoir heated by the slow decay of radioactive elements deep in the crust, the same process that powers volcanoes and hotspots around the world. The crystals grow atom by atom, century by century, a patience that makes human lifetimes seem like eye blinks. But the scientists can only explain the how, the why. Why one man was drawn to this place, why he saw possibilities where others saw only stone, why he built something lasting from the scraps that others discarded, remains a mystery that science cannot touch. Perhaps it was simply that Silas Crenshaw understood something that his brothers never did. Inheritance isn't what you're given. It's what you make from what you're given. The land that Marcus called worthless became a paradise because Silas looked at it with different eyes. The cave that Theodore would have walked past became a home because Silas was willing to go deeper, to ask questions, to learn. In the end, the mockery didn't matter. The rejection didn't matter. What mattered was the work, patient and persistent, day after day, year after year. What mattered was the willingness to see the world as it actually was, not as others said it should be. The hot spring still flows beneath the Arkansas hills, warm and constant, asking nothing and giving everything. Visitors come and go, soaking in the mineral water and marveling at the crystals, then returning to their lives of noise and hurry. But sometimes, late in the evening when the crowds have gone and the lamplight flickers on the ancient stone, the rangers say they can almost feel the presence of the man who first stepped into this darkness and saw it for what it truly was. Not a cave, not a curse, not a joke at a dead man's expense. A beginning.